for coming. Thank you all for coming, and thanks to both of you for being here in Washington.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It's so nice to see you again, Yotam, and to meet you for the first time, Helen. You know, there's this stereotype, I think, that chefs are like jazz musicians who can improvise and riff on things, but pastry chefs have to be mathematicians, have to follow the formula. You can throw a handful of something in a stew and improve it, but if you throw a handful of something in a cake, you'll probably ruin it.
I think that's not far from the truth.
So I wonder, first of all, how true that is, and also, in your experience, having both worked on the pastry side and the non-pastry side, when you approach a book like Sweet, how does your own style of cooking and approach to creating a recipe merge with that sort of mathematical, architectural requirement of cooking pastry?
I think we start off with this sort of more analytical, mathematical, even chemistry. The base of it sort of has to be structurally sound. And once we've established that, we then go to town with the creative side.
There are things that you can't play with. Like you said, you just can't throw something into a cake batter and hope for the best. It just doesn't work that way. But you can play with what we like to call sometimes garnishes, which can be a big thing. It could be the icing, it could be the fruit inside, it could be the spices or the herbs that you use in a dessert. So there's a lot you can do, but the basic cake recipe or the pie crust needs to be it needs to be understood and perfected before you can move on to all the other embellishments.
So as we talk about the embellishments, you both bring so many different backgrounds to this cuisine. Yotam, you spent your childhood in the Middle East and have lived in London for many years. Helen, you moved from Malaysia to Australia when you were 10 years old and have also lived in the UK for many years. Where in these recipes do you find the echoes of the Middle East, the echoes of Malaysia, the echoes of Australia?
Yeah, I mean, I think we see them all as just ingredients sort of at our doorstep, you know, rather than sort of something being particularly Asian or particularly Middle Eastern. We use ingredients to sort of augment a fairly European kind of tradition of baking, because we know that, we love that, it's very structurally sound. And then, you know, we bring in the other details from our more exotic sort of background.
I think this book in particular doesn't have things that are essentially Middle Eastern or Asian in the pure form. So there's no baklavas or babkas or glutinous rice.
We were discussing glutinous rice backstage.
Yeah, yes. from Malaysia. So those are steamed. Actually, there are really European cakes. You know, they're French and Italian and some North American and Australian influences, but they're not. Because this is how Helen and I have been trained. Both of us have come from, we trained in European traditions of baking, and I never used to bake before I learned how to bake. It wasn't I didn't do that so much of it. But when I started, I loved every bit of it. So when we bring our cultures in, we throw in halva and tahini or star anise or pineapple, or even on the cover of the book, there's pistachios and figs, which are, the flavors that I grew up with. So it's the flourishes, it's the garnishes, it's the stuff around the edges that really is where we put our marks.
But there are flavor combinations. I mean, for example, I lived in London for 2 years and fell in love with banoffee, which should be in the United States, but for some reason never ever is. It's the combination of banana and toffee, not crunchy toffee, but sort of runny, sticky toffee.
Yes.
Banoffee is everywhere in the UK, and it's nowhere in the United States.
Yeah.
And it finds its way into this book, which I think it probably weren't if you were American born and raised.
Right. I mean, rightly or wrongly, I have this idea that with baking especially, you don't want something completely foreign, because I think baking is still about comfort, it's still about sort of sharing, and you don't want anything that's sort of going to alienate people. But we want the little element of surprise, particularly Yotam, he loves a little surprise. So we start with fairly, we may even take something well-loved and well-known like a brownie, and then inject halva and tahini into it, because we like it's almost like straddling this line between comfort and discomfort.
That's interesting. You have worked together now for 10 years or more, and so I'd like to give you each the opportunity to throw a little bit of shade at the other. You both know what that means, right?
No,
No? Yotam, will you
Not at
explain the
all.
term? Throwing shade.
Okay, I guess what you want us to do is show the...
I have a specific request, but the term, first of all. It's a lovingly way of sort of disparaging the other person.
okay, oh gosh.
So what
Sorry,
I would
I
like
asked.
each of you to do is describe, when you are testing a recipe and you say to the other, what would make this better? What is the one thing that each of you knows the other will always say?
Okay.
So I know Helen. So Helen is really, I mean, she puts my perfectionism to shame because she is the ultimate perfectionist. I mean, she could agonize for hours, and if the structure is not as it should be for that particular cake.
Isn't that called neuroticism?
Neuroticism, that too. But you know, when we were working on the book, and I describe it in the introduction to the book because I kind of introduced Helen to the reader, and I described the scene at the in the introduction when Helen appears in the apartment where my husband and I live, and we look down from our living room window, and Helen arrives on a Sunday afternoon with a pile of boxes, like paper boxes, full of cakes, and Carl looks down and he tells me,
Carl, your husband.
my husband, he says, Helen's coming. With her cakes. And what that means is that we're in for an afternoon of joy and agony in equal measures, which means we're going to eat a lot of cakes, but we're going to have endless conversations about those cakes. And Helen is going to start with a massive apology about all the things that went wrong with her cakes. You know, that one didn't rise, and that one crumbled, and that one caramelized, and that one is not, but they're all really marvelous. And that's the thing, is they're all super good, but in her world, they're all complete failures. So that's Helen, you know, that's Helen in a nutshell. It's like that kind of, until she gets it right, she would just not rest or sleep. Is that right?
Well, didn't I say neurotic?
Helen, what's Yotam's predictable go-to when you're discussing a recipe and what can be improved? What will he always
Well, in a way,
suggest?
Yotam's sort of, I guess it's a really good quality, is his sort of excitement. It's quite a boyish excitement, you know, when you bring something. So he's kind of dreaming big and thinking what he can add to it. There's always another ingredient that he wants to add
It's
to
never
it.
enough, right? It's never quite enough.
It's never quite enough. But within all of that, there's usually something that just makes it, what was the verb? We Ottolengify it or Ottolengicize it with just this one thing that he'll think of.
So are you saying that Yotam is the maximalist and Helen is the minimalist?
I think that's actually a very good description. I would say, I mean, Yotam is not bounded by tradition, whereas I, you know, even if I didn't grow up in the European tradition, you know, I feel I know the French tradition quite well, and I would say, well, no, that's not how you do it. Or with the Malaysian or the more sort of Asian confections, I have an idea how it ought to be, and I don't like people messing with that. And with Yotam, there are no boundaries. He's not bounded by the tradition, and that really is quite freeing. At times it's infuriating, because you think, you know, no, you can't do that.
So without disparaging any of the individual recipes, is there a recipe in here that you think, had you each written the cookbook on your own, it might have had a little bit more if Yotam had written this cookbook, or it might have had a little bit less if Helen had written it?
Yeah, I can think of a few recipes like that.
Go
Name
on.
names. Name names.
So, for instance, but in a way I do appreciate it, because I wanted to say one thing, and I'm not just trying to gloss over our differences, but a book needs a balance, and in a balance you can't have all fireworks in every recipe. A book needs to have its ups and downs, and a baking book is exactly the same. So there are two recipes that are actually side by side that Helen absolutely loves. One is a lemon and poppy seed cake, and the other is a spice cake. And they're two beautiful recipes that are extremely simple in essence. They're two beautiful sponges with beautiful textures that are not very Ottolenghi, really, if you think about it. So I look at it.
Which is to say they're unembellished.
They're unembellished.
Simple.
And I'm really happy that we have them in the book, because they bring balance. But my inner instincts say, oh, we should just have added something. You know, there's something
Flowers
missing
on
this.
it or
Yeah, a couple
Helen, what do you think would have had less in it had you been the one to write this cookbook? Alone, I mean.
Alone. Halva, well, it's quite a bit of halva, and tahini, which I think are quite genius ingredients. I mean, I know that they're not so uncommon, but in the tradition of cake making and sweet making, it's just that little savory note that balances something. So we have something called the Millionaire's shortbread, which, you know, it's a lovely idea, but it's cloying, and it's often just too much of a good thing. And the addition of halva and tahini gives it that little savory note and a slightly bitter flavor that makes you feel you could eat the whole tray.
You also have a shortbread recipe in here that calls for orange zest and star anise, which sounds wonderful. And then it calls for 2 kinds of flour. Right. Italian 00 flour and white grainy rice flour. And when I read the cookbook, I thought, well, the orange zest and star anise in shortbread sounds wonderful, but am I really going to go out and find white grainy rice flour to augment the Italian 00 flour to make this shortbread just that much better?
You know, recently I was also slightly nervous about that. I thought, is this one step too many? Is it a bit gratuitous? You know, I did question that. But recently we've had a kind of flurry of people on the internet, on social media, having baked some goods. And the comments have been, the 2 flours are genius because,
really? It's
you
worth
know,
buying the 2 flours.
Yeah, because one's kind of slightly...
It really is.
Well, maybe you have it in your pantry already. If
Maybe, maybe. Raise your hand if you have both of those flours in your pantry right now. Wow.
1, there's 2, there's 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
I guess the thing is, for me, I always say, you know, people ask me questions like, is it really necessary to sift a flour twice? Is it really necessary to use, ground your own cardamom? And okay, maybe not. But actually, for me, if you're going to go to the trouble of inviting people, go shopping to get your ingredients, get your cake tin, to plan something, then wouldn't you want to make it the absolute best that you possibly can? Because that's the short step. You know, all the other things around it is sort of all the decision-making and all the preparation. That's the hard work. Sifting it or getting another bag of flour is really easy.
And I have to agree with Helen on that point. Also, shortbreads are a simple thing. So in a way, just to make sure that you've got the perfect texture, the ground rice is really about adding a little bit of grit to your shortbread so it's not completely soft. And it really makes a difference. So when people have that and say, why should I make an Ottolenghi shortbread if it doesn't have something special to offer? So that was the kind of, that's the thing. But that we have in mind, but it really does work. And these are the shortbreads that we sell in the shop every, you know, holiday season, and people absolutely love them. But I want to just follow up on that point that Helen mentioned about making an extra effort. I really think that baking is very different to savory cooking on that front, because baking is not a necessity. You know, you don't need to make a cake. Well, in the same way that you need to cook, right? Because you're going to feed yourself or your family. That's a kind of it's a necessity. But baking is special, and you give time to baking, which you don't necessarily have to give to cooking. You can rush your cooking, but you don't rush a cake. You know, it's just there's an amount of time you give to it. You give the time, the space in the day, and you do it. And I think that is very true. And I think so. Going out of your way to get what you need and double sifting, like sometimes we suggest, or doing those kind of things, really, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference if you're already in that frame of mind.
You explained in the introduction that while there are gluten-free recipes in this cookbook, and there may be recipes that are low in sugar or that don't have nuts, you did not set out to accommodate the various dietary requirements of many cooks and diners today. Why not? And what would you describe your approach as being in contrast to that sort of exclusionary approach?
It's not either this or that. I think what we've been, first of all, the impetus to what made us start writing this book was really representing what we do at Ottolenghi. So the first thing we did is, for people who have been asking for many years for an Ottolenghi baking book, because even though there have been desserts and baking and cakes in other books, they haven't really had much exposure, and there wasn't much of them. So they wanted cakes. And from the beginning in Ottolenghi, it was all about kind of it was all about celebrating life and pleasure. And when you go to an Ottolenghi, it really has that kind of pleasurable atmosphere, visually, and also when you taste the food. So we wanted to bring out those cakes, and then after that it was filling in the holes as a book. Like I said, you want to create a book that is balanced, so we added desserts and confectionery and certain items that we don't necessarily have in the shops. But then if we were to try to cover other angles, like trying to find, then we would be competing in a market where there's tons of books that address these things. So, all the books with alternative flours and alternative sugars and low in sugars, that's a saturated market already now in 2017. So in a sense, it would have made much more sense for us to go and do what we know so well.
Yeah, I think we wanted to focus on doing what we do really, really well. And maybe if we'd had an extra year, maybe we could have sort of, done more with that.
You're pretty honest about not loving the enormous meringues that draw people into the Ottolenghi shops. One of which was around the corner from where I lived in London, and I probably spent a few too many calories and a few too many pounds, but it was all worth it, going around the corner there every day. And so I wonder, if not the meringues, is there an item that you sell in the shop that you wish were more popular, that you wish everybody loved as much as you do, that you hope will become the most popular item in this cookbook?
It's tricky, actually, because, we love cakes. We only put out cakes that we love, but they also have to sell. And if not enough people like them, we do take them off. Yeah. So
I think what we find difficult to occasionally, or let's say challenging, to deal with is things that don't have the visual fireworks.
Yeah.
That
I
was surprised in this book you said too many of the recipes were colorless and you had to add more color.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Well, you see the result. No, but the thing is, when you shoot a cake, when you photograph a cake, it's brown normally because this is the color of cakes. And this was worrying me because halfway through the book, we were looking at the galleys, and I called Helen quite frantic and said, "Helen, we've got a problem. All the cakes are brown." So Helen rushed and tried. Helen tested the recipes at home before I tested them in my test kitchen, and introduced color to the book, and hence we've got a black currant and lemon stripe cake, which is quite striking. It's one of the beautiful recipes in the book, and we added a few icings and certain things to, like the financiers, and we added color to the book at that stage. It's difficult, and one of the things that we have is when we put a cake on the display that is just absolutely delicious, it has to compete with a lot of things that just look more spectacular. And the moment you stick a raspberry on something, for some reason everybody wants to buy it. Although it's just a tiny raspberry on a cake, it won't make a huge flavor difference, but it is. People really buy cakes. I'm a retailer, really. That's what we do. I sell food. You see at the end of the day what's popular, and the one that had the raspberry is so much more likely to sell than the one that didn't have it.
And so you don't have like a beloved child who no one else loves as much as you do?
Well, it's quite bewildering because you never really know. Although color sells and making something sort of sexing it up in a way, that works. There are also the times when you don't really know whether something is going to work. We're quite bewildered because we both like poppy seeds, and we've never been able to sell something with poppy seeds.
Oh. Okay, so speaking of unattractive desserts, can we talk about flapjacks? Which my London producer and I had a 2-year running debate over whether this is a food worth buying, making, and eating or not. He was very much in the pro camp. I was in the con camp. Not to make, not to buy, not to eat. You have a recipe for flapjacks in here, though you don't call them flapjacks. They're different from American flapjacks.
Yeah.
Will you explain what they are, where you stand on this debate, and defend them, if you will, because I fail to see the appeal.
I get that because I was the same. And for me, flapjacks coming from Australia, they're pancakes, right?
That's what we think of flapjacks as being. But the British flapjack is...
Yes. British flapjack is a kind of apology for
It's a granola bar.
It's a granola bar.
It's a granola bar.
It's a granola bar.
And what really irks me about that is that it's kind of sold as health food. And it's anything but health food. Right. But we have a very, some of the people who work in the test kitchen are very British, and they felt very strongly about that recipe. Not just that 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 everybody loves flapjacks. That was their position.
Clearly not true.
Right, clearly not true. But actually, I think, well, I was with you, and then I started to work, and I like a challenge, you know, so they felt that we needed a flapjack, and I thought, well, I'll work on one that's not sort of too cloying, and that has a little bit of a lift to it, which ours has a orange blossom water and dates, and a few other spices. And I've changed my mind.
Are you telling me this is going to be the flapjack that
She's,
converts me?
Maybe.
well, yeah, I think it will, because, you know, I also didn't want a flapjack in the book.
Yeah.
And only when Helen presented that flapjack to me, I was completely convinced that it's worthwhile having. And again, in the name of creating a certain amount of balance in the book, as a curator does, you know, like this works with that, I thought, okay, well, that is approachable. And a lot of people I noticed bake it.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
yes.
one of the popular ones, isn't it?
It is.
There's a lot of alcohol in these desserts. There's even a dessert inspired by a gin and tonic.
And there's one cake that has a whole bottle of Baume de Venise dessert wine.
Which is your favorite cake?
Which is my favorite cake in the book, yeah.
Should we read anything into this?
You can
It's
read
obvious.
what you like. No, it's just such a great thing. Alcohol is like, you know, it's already had. Sorry, I'm not really going to.
That's the pull
try
quote.
to defend myself, but it's, you know, everybody likes to talk these days about fermentation, right? Fermentation is a buzzword in the world of foodies. Everybody likes to ferment. Wine has been fermenting for about 8,000 years or 7,000 years, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, when you pour wine into a dessert, you get all these flavors of fermentation that have been kind of done for you. So it really saves you quite a lot of work in infusing flavor into your thing. So it's a shortcut, really. It's
But
a
also
shortcut to
we're always-
flavor.
Good justification.
It's a shortcut to flavor.
It's sounding very, defensive. But I think it's also about balance. You know, ultimately, we have every single recipe in there has sugar in it. And we're looking for things that balance sugar, whether it's tahini or alcohol. They're things that sort of wrestle with it a little bit so that you don't have a one-dimensional sugary note. I think that's, you know.
There are a lot of interesting, surprising ingredients in the cookbook. There was one ingredient that to me was in a category of its own. And before I ask you about it, I wonder what each of you would name as sort of the most surprising, interesting ingredient in this cookbook.
Is it malab?
No, but
No.
good guess.
Okay.
Wait, what is that?
Malab.
What is malab?
Malab is it's ground seed or nut of a cherry.
Like a cherry pit?
Like a cherry pit, exactly.
But not any cherry, a particular cherry.
Okay, so you
didn't
can't just
expect it
grind
to be
cherry.
no. It's not any
Where
cherry.
does that ingredient come from?
It's a particular. It's from the Middle East.
Actually, I
and-
learned today it's Armenian.
Armenian.
Yes,
So
Armenian.
And it's used in Armenian cooking, Turkish cooking, and in Arab cooking, and it adds a little bit of, essentially it's a cherry stone, but it's a particular cherry. It's called Santa Lucia. It's a Santa Lucia.
Yes, Santa Lucia, yes.
And it's dried and ground. That it gives it the flavor of bitter almonds, but a bit more cherry and fruity.
Wow. Okay, so that's a very good candidate.
Well, and before you sort of close the book and
Yeah,
decide
yeah.
it's not for you because of that, we're very conscious in the book that we ask for something that's quite exotic or a bit different, that we give a substitute, you know.
So what would the substitute for that be?
Would be almond essence.
Almond
Almond
essence,
essence.
yeah.
Almond essence.
Okay, Yotam, what's your
My
candidate?
guess. What would you have picked on? I can't even think.
No, what would you choose?
Pandan. Is it pandan?
Pandan is a good choice, but not the one that I
What were you
grabbed.
thinking?
Well,
Gosh.
you want to explain what pandan is?
Pandan are leaves that look, or maybe long shoots of leaves from Asia, Southeast Asia. In Malaysia, where Helen grew up, it's used to infuse in rice and in desserts, and it's a bit like, they call it the Southeast Asian vanilla. It's kind of a flavor that is really widely used in desserts throughout
Yeah,
Asia.
it's also used for its color, so it's ground and extracted for the color. We were talking about Indonesian sweets.
It's
and-
green.
I got back
It's
from
green.
Indonesia this
Green.
morning, and there was a great pandan dessert there that we were discussing. that I guess also exists in Malaysia. What's it called again?
Pandan.
No, the dessert.
Oh, the dessert. Onde.
Onde. This man with a cart walks around, and the cart is whistling like a tea kettle, and he takes this glutinous green rice and palm sugar in the middle, and he plugs the hole in the steamer with it, and it melts. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's delicious. I had that when Helen took me to Malaysia.
And then it's rolled in coconut.
Oh, it's
But
so
also,
good.
when you were talking about it, it really brought back my childhood in Malaysia, where you would have hawkers on bicycles. And one of my enduring memories is of this hawker with this huge metal tray on the back of his bicycle. And it was actually essentially a brittle, a kind of toffee. And he would sound this horn so that you know that he's in your street. And we would all rush out, my sisters and I, with coins to see how much of this brittle we could buy. And depending on how much money you had, he would sort of have this tiny hammer and chisel a little bit off for you and put it in a paper cone for you. And
What I loved about
that.
Indonesia, the food carts, especially as a radio person, is that each cart made a different noise.
Yes, exactly.
So there was the tea kettle whistle,
Yes,
there was like a
that's
wood
right.
knocker, there was a horn,
Yes.
and based on the noise, you knew what the person
Exactly.
was selling.
Yes.
So back to the most surprising ingredient.
You
My
tell us.
choice,
What?
a vitamin C tablet.
Oh, yes.
Never seen that in any cookbook before. Explain.
Shall I explain?
Yes.
Maybe I'll do a little detour and tell you about my argument with Helen about carrot cake.
Oh,
because
yes.
Helen and I have very different approaches to carrot cakes. So I like my carrot cakes a little. I mean, you caricaturize them, but actually they're just a little bit lighter, so they've got egg whites folded
It's not
through.
a carrot cake.
And
It's a sponge cake with carrot.
Helen likes dense, rich, fruity carrot cakes, and so they're quite different. I mean, I won't say what I think about your carrot cakes the way you just said about mine. I'll spare you that.
He's a better man than I.
Please do.
But since we haven't managed to square that circle or find a compromise, Helen got her way by introducing two other root vegetable cakes into the book. One is a beet cake and the other is a parsnip cake. And they're rich and fruity and delicious. And but the problem is that the beet cake had a beautiful color as a batter, as a cake mix. As you can imagine, it's got lots of raw beetroot, and it was bright red. But the moment we baked it, all the red just disappeared, and it turned into another brown cake. So, just another brown cake. So at that moment, I remember that in the past, when I was working in another place before we opened Ottolenghi, we used to cook our quinces with a tablet of vitamin C, and it made them keep their color much more, or turn a nice dark, deep red that quince does when you cook it long enough and with enough sugar.
Would you pound the tablet like in a mortar and pestle into a
Well,
powder?
in a sense, when you put it in, it would just dissolve because you put it with the liquids but for the cake, we need to pound it.
We do.
So I just suggested we throw a vitamin C tablet into our beet cake, and it worked. It really kept much more of the color than it did before.
Yeah.
But it's optional. You don't have to do it.
If you'd like a brown cake,
Yes.
you can leave it out.
Like a brown cake.
Okay, I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. So we have two microphones in the front, and you can line up. And while people are lining up, let me close by just asking, I'm sure there are some people in the audience who are ambitious bakers, and some people in the audience who are afraid of brownies. And so if you could each choose a recipe for each type of baker from this book, what would you point people to?
I think biscuits, or what you call cookies here, it's sort of low investment, low risk. Doesn't matter if it's out of shape. I would think the chocolate pecan and banana is a very good point to begin if you are
And for the more
nervous.
ambitious baker?
Oh, there's only one for
There's
that
only
one.
one, yeah.
Yes, it's the frozen espresso parfait for a crowd. Actually, somebody asked recently, what would you cook for heartbreak? And it would be that one. What would you cook for celebration? It would be that one.
Yotam,
So it's
what
pretty
would your,
epic.
What would your two choices be?
So I have to, I can't let her have the frozen espresso parfait for a crowd because it is the most incredible thing. It's a little bit of work, and you need to bake meringue and make a coffee parfait or ice cream in between. But it's just one of those things that you just can't have enough of. It's super sweet, but it's so delicious. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I would go for something like one of the sponges that we mentioned earlier, the lemon or the cake or the spice cake, because they are very gratifying and they're super easy to make, and you don't need any kind of serious equipment. You need your bowls and your whisks, and that's about it, and the tin to bake it in.
Great. Sounds delicious. Let's take some questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for your words today. I'm reading the book with great interest, and one thing that I was wondering is, while working on the book, was there anything that you found particularly interesting and/or surprising about any of about the origins and history of any of the recipes in the book?
The origins of the history. I'm trying to think.
Well, I mean, we have an origin in the history of one particular recipe. It's not exactly cultural or historical. It's more to do with my history, actually. I don't know if that's very interesting to anyone else. Yeah, but it was a okay, so it's called powder puffs in the book. And I first had this without knowing that it was called powder puffs at a funeral many, many years ago, decades ago. And I didn't know the family of the deceased very well. I went to support my new partner at the time. And after the service, this sort of table of cakes and treats were sort of put out. And I remember being drawn to this sort of pile of what looked like fairly ordinary little round, tiny cakes, I guess they looked like. But when I had it, I was completely blown away. It was just ethereally soft. And if you can imagine what the word powder puff conjures, it's exactly what it tasted like. Anyway, I broke up with the boyfriend, and it was a one-step.
Also, you said you didn't feel right to ask.
Well, of course,
for a recipe in
a funeral is not the right place to be sourcing recipes. I mean, I had that much diplomacy not to do that. So it was kind of lost in a way. And many, many years later in Australia, a very well-known chef, Stephanie Alexander, who had a regular column in the paper, she published a recipe called Aunt Peggy's Powder Puffs. And this funeral was in country Victoria, which is sort of outside of Melbourne, and something about the title of the recipe, Aunt Peggy's Powder Puffs, I immediately knew this was what I had had all those years ago there. And I followed her recipe and recreated this thing, and it's given us great joy. But we did Ottolengify it by adding raspberry and rosewater to it, which I think has given it another dimension.
Thank you. Yes?
Well, we've talked a lot about exotic ingredients, from vitamin C to an exotic cyanide delivery vehicle from these cherry pits. And I wondered about another exotic ingredient that I always check whenever there's someone from Southeast Asia on the list. And it's not in the cookbook, so I wonder if any durian recipes got left on the cutting room floor, or how would you suggest Ottolengifying some durian?
Yeah. Well, when Yotam and I traveled to Malaysia together in 2009, I think that was the point where I think he was going to run away from me. He would try anything else, but I think the durian was just really the last straw.
A fruit too far?
A fruit too far.
That's a
But
shame.
I personally love it. I mean, I don't understand what, that it's banned in hotels and public transport. For me, it's like custard.
Whenever I'm asked, is there anything you don't eat? I say I eat absolutely everything.
Excellent.
Apart from durian.
Really?
Yeah, that is the one thing. I do anything for Helen, and I tried, but I couldn't withhold it.
I actually did bring some durian candies from Indonesia back for the staff of All Things Considered, so everybody tomorrow will
Have
be
they
able
tried
to.
them?
No, tomorrow I'll bring them in. But I was on a ferry where somebody was carrying durian, and you could smell it on the whole ferry boat.
Doesn't it smell delicious?
I once heard somebody say, "Don't yuck someone else's yum." So with that in mind, I'm going to refrain.
All these diplomatic men, I mean.
Yes.
Hi, I have two questions. Also, I'm quite short. So my first question, your cookbooks have a very distinct look to them, as does your restaurants. I went to Nopi this past summer and saw the beautiful gold brass and the wood cardboard. So who inspires you aesthetically? And my second question is, where have you gone to eat in DC?
Inspire aesthetically, I think the way we operate the company, we're 4 partners, and everybody is involved, has got areas, responsibilities, and we always work in partnership. And when restaurants are designs or the design comes up, people pinch in with giving their own ideas. So I would give my own, whatever it's worth, and Sammy and Cornelia, no, I mean, at the end we have a good friend, Alex, who's an architect, and he designs our restaurants and delis. But the other aspects that have to do with the look of the display, how the food is displayed, is Sammy and my responsibility. And we spend a lot of time creating those displays, and it's one of those things, I think, in the back of my mind, we think of ourselves as like stall holders in a souk in the Middle East. We can spend hours arranging our displays, to no avail. It's just like, it seems completely ridiculous, but it's very important to us. And I think over time we realize that it really pays off, because people love those displays, and they really react to them. And I bring the same attitude or approach to the books. I spend a lot of time arranging the food in front of the camera. We don't have a stylist, so I'm the stylist in the house when Helen...
But it's not just about the food, is it? Because you love platters. Sometimes Yotam has a platter and he wants to use that platter. You've just got to find something to put on it.
Fair enough.
I am shocked to hear that you don't have a stylist, given some of these photographs seem so highly styled. This is your doing?
Well, we had a couple of photographers called Payton and Monk. It's a husband and wife team from New York City. And they shot this book. So in between them and me, yes, we did the styling. Yeah.
Oh, and then where have you eaten in Washington?
We've just finished. We just had the biggest meal.
Yes, we have. We had an hour and a half between our last event, and we really wanted to eat at this place, but also because this is a question that is asked all the time, and Yotam said, we've got to say something. So we had a terrific meal at Rose's Luxury.
And they waited in line with the masses.
We waited in line for 45 minutes at 30 degrees centigrade. I know it doesn't sound a lot in Fahrenheit, but it was hot.
And was it worth it?
Yes.
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was.
Hi. Okay.
Hello.
So I was curious because I flipped through the book while waiting for you guys to show up, and I noticed you didn't have any particular bread recipes in there. And while bread can be sweet and savory, typically we think of it more of the savory. So why did you choose not to include any particular bread recipes? And if you did, what would you include?
Sorry, I didn't understand.
Bread.
Oh, yes, right, yeah.
I think we started off having these savory dishes, baked items in mind, like breads and savory pastries. But the list was just so long, we needed to focus, because it was going to be a general kind of baking book. And we wanted really to focus on something. We already found it really difficult to narrow it down to 120 odd recipes that we have in this book. So we left that for the next book.
I think also because bread is so technically, I mean, there are challenges with working with yeast, and there are good books that kind of devote entire volumes to doing that. And we felt that actually we didn't want to sort of do something cursorily because that really is quite demanding.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. I was most excited about getting your book because of the mini cakes that you do. So I was just thrilled at the whole section. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about converting of a recipe that comes in a bigger volume to mini versions. I mean, I know you have to watch them shorter times, but do you adjust temperature or any other techniques that you have? Would be great.
It's not so straightforward. I mean, it sort of almost seems logical. You could just divide a recipe. And we work very hard to sort of think about what would be best for the person cooking at home. And unfortunately, I think in a way we've erred on the side of having rather more than less. One, because we're slightly greedy people. Well, I am. And two, because I rather have lots and then freeze, a larger cake and then freeze it. So other considerations are that if a recipe has an uneven number of eggs, it's quite difficult to half, 3 eggs, for example. But having said that, there's a bit of logic involved in there too. So some of the things I've seen people, for example, the lemon and poppy seed cake, which we bake in a loaf, you could make them in muffin tins.
Sorry,
and
that's
I
more
guess
of what I meant, was converting it to, the mini sizes.
yeah, you could do that, and then temperature,
Yeah,
not so much temperature, length of cooking time.
Yeah.
Just length, okay.
Most recipes can be scaled down or divided down into individuals, but some don't. So you just need to experiment, and obviously the cooking time would vary radically
Right.
from. And the other thing I want to say that some cakes are meant to be big and some cakes are meant to be large. There's something about the proportion between the outside and the inside that is just right for a particular cake. For instance, a financier has got a really nice chewy outside and a soft middle, and if you were to scale it up, it would just not be right. You need that kind of balance between outside and inside. So not every cake can be turned into different sizes.
But we are converts to the idea of little cakes too, which is why there's a big section on little cakes. Yeah.
That's great, thank you.
Hi. My mum used to live on Liverpool Road, just around the corner in Angel Islington, so I've been a fan for a very long time. But I had a question about what would you advise someone to have in their kitchen as sort of the top items that you have to have in your kitchen in order to execute this book well, or just to have on hand? And also, do you have a sort of rubric for your surprise? How do you create that surprise, the Ottolengifying? What is your sort of process for thinking about what's going to work?
In terms of equipment, I think it really depends on how far you want to go and how much you want to invest. I mean, baking, actually, the kind of baking that we do in this book doesn't require very fancy equipment. I think we always say, you need a set of bowls of different proportions so you can weigh out your ingredients, and you need big ones so you can fold in, and you need deeper ones and shallower ones for different things. So you really want a nice set of mixing bowls. You want measuring spoons, and if you want to follow our method, you want to scale. If you want to follow the American method, you buy measuring cups. And we love to convert everybody to scales because they're so much better for baking. They're so much more accurate. And I know there's a whole industry of measuring cups, and we don't want to put them out of business, but scales are really so much better. And then you want you don't have to have a freestanding mixer if that's expensive or that happen, but it does save you time when you can just put a cake and you can go do something else and not hold your handheld mixer. You need
Yeah,
what
I
else?
think it also makes baking very joyous when you've got the right equipment. It seems a big investment to have a mixer, but it just means that you can really enjoy it, and it is much simpler. Yeah.
There was another question at the end that I can't remember.
Your process for the surprise factor.
Surprise.
What's your process for creating surprise?
It's hard to break down.
Yes.
I think to create a surprise, you kind of try to find a left field kind of way of approaching a cake, and every time it's something else, whether it's adding a spice or adding a herb that might not be out of context in baking, and kind of bringing it in to break through the sweetness.
I think one of the things that I've learned working with Yotam is to embrace failure, because not that he fails.
All the time.
I don't mean that,
It's the
but
story of my life.
to be emboldened, to try something new. And what's the worst that can happen? I mean, obviously, don't try it before your dinner party, just before that, but to just try, give it a go, and not to be worried,
In that vein, to what extent would you encourage people to swap out figs for apricots, or cinnamon for cardamom, or other experimentation, pecans for walnuts, or whatever? I mean, in this cookbook with these recipes.
Yeah, there are a number of notes throughout, what would be good to what you can substitute without sort of breaking down the integrity of the recipes. So, and it's not always clear cut, because some fruits have more liquid than others. So for example, we've been demonstrating this rolled Pavlova in a number of the events. And in the book it has peaches and blackberry, which sort of at the end of summer and beginning of autumn is sort of really nice. But the peaches is really just on their way out. And at an event, where was it? New York City, yeah. We couldn't get good peaches, and someone suggested figs, which sounds good because they're lovely, they're in season, they look great. But actually, figs are very sweet, and meringue's sweet, and I thought I really wanted something sharper. So you're kind of constantly balancing those flavors and textures as well. You know, figs are very soft. Well, I've got this soft meringue, and I want sort of something a little more pronounced, I guess, yeah.
So don't F with the recipes. Yes.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, first, thank you so much for the cookbooks. They've been a fantastic companion in the kitchen and at home for a while, so thanks for another one. I wanted to ask you where in DC you had eaten and if that had led you to an exciting meal, but you already answered that, so then I was wondering what the essentials in a kitchen would be, but you answered that already, so this is getting awkward. So I had to come up with something on the fly because I'm already in line, but...
Shall we help you? Would you like some help?
That sounds good, yeah.
What are the spices that you would have in your cupboard for baking, Helen?
Well, I won't say Marleb because I'm a convert to cardamom, but only if it's freshly ground. And I know that makes me sound very sort of pedantic, but it's a huge difference between ground cardamom and freshly ground cardamom or cardamom pods and ready bought ground cardamom. I like something called mixed spice, which is probably more like the American pumpkin spice. I think a pinch of that adds a great depth to cakes.
How frequently do you replace the spices in your cupboard, or do you go through them so quickly that you don't need to?
I do go through them very quickly, yes. Yeah.
How quickly would you recommend we all throw out
Well,
spices that have been in our cupboard? Those of us who aren't baking every single day.
Well, the thing is, again, it's back to that thing where, in the past I would sort of hold on to this sort of jar of spice forever, and it's very difficult to throw anything out, And then I think, well, it costs, $1.99. And actually, if I'm going to make this cake, that's really, I put a lot of thought into it. I'm serving it to people I love. What, go and buy another packet of spice. That's how I think of it.
Sure.
So once, after 6 months or so.
Yeah, 6 months.
From opening, you want to get a fresh one.
Or maybe just cook more often.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So first I'd like to say, Helen, I've never seen any of your carrot cake recipes anywhere, but Yotam, I have made yours, and it is so good. I don't know if anyone else has made the carrot cake recipe.
Thank you. I needed that support.
It is so good.
I needed that. Thank you.
So my question is, I learned very early on cooking from your recipes that I need to read through the whole recipe and really allocate a lot of time, because I have found myself often like, oh shoot, the eggplant needs to be in the oven for 90 minutes instead of 30 minutes. Like, things come out later. So I was just wondering why you guys never put in timing guidelines in your cookbooks, and then you never put in this should take you 3 hours, or and relatedly, how long does it take you to make any given cake or cookie?
I think it's a good idea. I think we should have it in the next book, for sure. And in this book, there are certain guidelines as to complexity, and not for every recipe, but we do say how to get organized, how long things would normally take. So there's much more guidelines here. Because it's baking, because it's clear for us how long things would take. You could do that. But with general cooking, I will say, it is very useful to know how long things would take. But things take different.
I always thought you just didn't want to scare people like this. It would take a long time, but I'm wondering if that's intentional.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
You can leave your name with the staff so that you can get a credit in the next cookbook.
We'll take these 4 last questions.
Okay.
Hi. You have done such an amazing job inspiring the masses. I would love to know who inspires you, and if there's a savory or sweet chef or cookbook that's your go-to.
So I'm kind of, people who read my books would notice that I credit a lot of people around me for the recipes, and I always find that I find them mostly inspired by the people that are closest to me. Because in our restaurants, we've got lots of chefs working, and there's always a conversation going on. And I find these conversations really incredibly illuminating. And we have chefs meetings once in a while where everybody gets together and bring cakes or whatever it is that we're testing. And I find these meetings so incredibly productive. Everybody brings a little bit of their biography, a little bit of their history, a little something that I haven't had before. So these are really the inspirations. And working with Helen or with Scully on the Nopi book before this one, or with Sammy in the past, has always been, these are the most inspiring moments that I have. I mean, I've got tons of cookbooks, and even in this book, Helen and I credit quite a lot of our heroes. You know, we've used a lot of recipes that we have seen in other places as basic recipes for us, like rose levy, barn bones, Bibles for pastries and for cakes. They were very useful. Which others?
We've credited quite a lot of people, individual recipes. Sometimes we even use as a base someone's exact recipe, and we Ottolengify it somewhat. And I think probably from both our academic traditions, we see it as a kind of conversation that if you're writing a thesis, you obviously research on who's had something to say about it. You add your little bit, however tiny it is, it adds to the conversation. And then it goes back into that kind of repository of ideas where other people can access. And I think we approach recipes like that it's not a static thing, but it's kind of an ongoing conversation with other bakers and other people.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for being committed to politics and prose and Sixth and I. This is our third signing with you here, so it's really nice that you keep coming back. My question has to do with your experience in line today and the 30°C weather and the humidity. What are some of your recommendations and tips for home cooks with really hot and humid kitchens?
It's difficult. I mean, first of all, I would just say that we have had, when we were testing the confectionery section in our book, it was an untypically humid period and hot and humid period in London. And we were really struggling with certain things that humidity doesn't agree with confectionery. So especially meringues, as soon as you dry them in the oven, you take them out and you leave them in humidity, they start to weep and bloom, and it's not good. And that's true for many others, toffees, and it was a bit of a nightmare. I remember when Sarah was trying all those toffees.
Yes, although we had a demonstration with meringue today, and despite the humidity, it worked beautifully.
It was an air-conditioned room, I have to say.
I think cakes are pretty safe, but I would avoid meringues and confectionery.
Yeah, I would agree about that, and also. One of the things that's quite important is not to always cover your cakes with what do you call them? Cling film here?
Plastic wrap.
Plastic wrap. Or because those capture humidity. So it's better to leave things mostly uncovered, maybe just with a towel draped on top, or especially with meringues or other confectionery, rather than let them kind of stew in their own air.
What about refrigeration?
I'm not a big fan of refrigeration in general. I think most cakes just really suffer from refrigeration. I mean, there's a lot of, obviously cheesecakes are a good exception, but many cakes just don't benefit from refrigeration and are hard to resurrect because it dries out the crumb.
I think the thing with cakes, if you were wanting to make ahead of time and felt that you needed to refrigerate, is to make the cake, but then make the frosting separately, refrigerate the frosting if it contains cream cheese or a lot of butter, and then frost it sort of as close to serving time as possible. So you could make the cake ahead of time, which doesn't need refrigeration, and just assemble it at the last minute.
Thank you.
Thank you for helping me to become a better cook and now a better baker. And I was wondering, did you have to approach writing your instructions differently, or how did you, because they're so clear in the cookbooks, how did you approach that for baking? Did you have extra testers, or how did that work? Or is there a skill that's particularly hard to convey in the written word without using like a YouTube video or something?
I think that baking instructions are actually very easy to convey. I think baking recipe is normally more descriptive and more prescriptive than other savory cooking recipes because the parameters are quite clear. You know, you've got pans in certain size and everybody has them, and those are the ones you're going to cook in, and the oven temperature. So normally baking, if you follow the instructions and the recipe works, they're quite good in terms of assessing the final results. So what we tried to do when we tested the book is really make sure that all those markers were properly checked and tested, and we have a very rigorous, someone would say anal, way of testing recipes, which is that we're testing them to infinity. You know, we test the recipes over and over and over again because we're never quite sure that they're going to work for everybody. And I think for us, it's a very reassuring place to be, that we know that different people tried our recipes in different kitchens and they worked. And in this particular book, for the first time, all the recipes have been tested in North America as well, in San Francisco.
Why was that true of this book for the first time?
Because with baking, it's just a bit more sensitive to ingredients. So the flour here is a bit different. The sugar is a bit the inverted sugars are a bit different. And we found that it's very useful to try recipes here and get input from an American tester.
Was there any recipe that was very different when the Americans tried it that you had to make dramatic changes to?
Not dramatic, but changes, yes, because certain ingredients just don't behave the same. You know, when we use some recipes call for glucose syrup, but you use corn syrup, and they're very different viscosity, and they behave very differently in baking. The cream cheeses are different.
Oh yes, cream cheese is a big thing.
Cream cheeses,
American. You can buy treacle in the UK and cannot in the US, or at least not easily.
Yeah, although molasses, I mean, we could figure that one out. But the cream cheese is tricky. We have annoyingly, quite a watery cream cheese, so our cheesecakes whip together very sort of quickly and is sort of more pourable. And I would say the American cheesecakes are more sort of scoopable. You might need to just beat your cream cheese a little longer than what we do.
Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Before we take the last question, I just want to say that when we were backstage chatting, I said to Yotam and Helen, is there anything that you're sick of talking about that you don't want me to ask? And they said,
it hasn't been asked yet.
And they said, well, I'm sure this question will come from the audience. And it hasn't yet. So
let's see.
Let's see what your question is.
No pressure or anything.
No, but this is the question they're sick of, so.
Well, first of all, it's blowing my mind to be able to see you while you're talking, Ari, so I have to say. I
don't usually see my audience either.
Right.
So it's blowing my mind too to see all of you.
The radio it'll never be the same for me now. But so I am allergic to gluten, and I appreciate that you put the little gluten-free symbol there, and not to bastardize any of your recipes.
By the way, that's not the question.
Thank goodness. But I was wondering if there are recipes that you could alter, like if I wanted to alter at home, if you've thought about or could suggest how to do that with some of them. And I also challenge you to, for your next especially baking book, Ottolenghi goes gluten-free. Just a suggestion.
I think it's a good suggestion. You know, I'm tired of sort of saying, being slightly defensive about not having alternative, either vegan or gluten-free, and I think it's probably about time that we really work on it. Yeah.
But in terms of advice for altering or playing with recipes, I think you need to judge each recipe, and you kind of, if you start checking, you will know which recipes are more likely to be altered in a particular way. So if a recipe calls for very little flour, then obviously the risk is much lower, and you can use, you can go for almond meal or gluten-free flours, etc. If it's a recipe full of flour, then obviously the risks are bigger, and it's just a matter of playing with the recipes, I would say, and each one will probably behave a little bit differently.
Thank you.
Since no one did ask the question that you're sick of.
Oh, no.
Just for fun. That question was, are you ever going to open a restaurant in Washington, D.C.?
I think this is one of the best renditions of that question, isn't it?
It was very well asked.
You can tell he's on the radio, right? So we've got a standard answer, right? Because we have it every time. This is the first time on our book tour that we had to have the host ask a question.
And he knew you didn't want the question asked, and he did it anyway.
So the answer is that I don't think if you've figured that out already by now or not, but we're perfectionists, and it's always very hard to figure out how you run a restaurant that's many thousands of miles away without literally hopping on an airplane every other day. So as much as I would have loved to have considered it, I always think, how do you do that? How do you actually do that? And so we haven't figured that out yet, but I think Elon Musk is working on something that might help us. So we'll wait for that.
Until then, we'll make the recipes ourselves. Yotam and Helen, thank you both so much.
Thank you, Ari.